Good morning, everybody. The committee will come to order, and I would note that at the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 1633, the Farm Dust Regulation Prevention Act of 2011, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. So at this juncture, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, I will call the chair. Are there any other amendments wishing to be up? Let me go to Mr. Waxman first, and then Mr. McKinley.
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm beginning to wonder, what did the Clean Air Act ever do to the Republicans? I ask because under Republican leadership, this committee's agenda has been relentlessly anti-environmental, anti-EPA, anti-Clean Air Act, and pro-pollution. In fact, this committee's agenda is profoundly harmful to public health. Today, we have yet another attack on the Clean Air Act. So far this year, the House has voted 170 times to weaken our environmental laws. The biggest single target has been the Clean Air Act. We have voted 61 times to dismantle the Clean Air Act, and if this bill comes to the floor, it will be the 62nd time. This committee has voted time and again to stop EPA from taking action on air pollution. Today's bill would stop EPA even though they are not taking action. H.R. 1633 is called the Farm Dust Regulation Prevention Act of 2011. Despite the bill's title, EPA does not regulate dust from farms, does not intend to regulate dust from farms. The administrator recently announced that she intends to propose no change to the PM10 standards. There's no need for legislation here. We might as well tell EPA not to regulate fairy dust. In fact, this bill is not really about farms at all. It exempts industrial mining operations from regulation under the Clean Air Act, and it rolls back the particulate standards that protect families in both rural and urban communities. Section 3 of the bill exempts so-called nuisance dust from any regulation under the Clean Air Act. Well, that's a new term. So it's defined as in a very incredibly broad way. The definition covers both coarse particulates and deadly fine particulates. It covers particulates from earth moving, which means industrial mining operations, and from activities typically conducted in rural areas, which include cement plants, smelters, and coal processing plants. Most of the particulate pollution from these sources isn't from combustion, so the subcommittee didn't fix this. Yet under this bill, these sources would be exempt from regulation under the Clean Air Act. There are other serious problems with the bill. According to EPA, the broad exemption for nuisance dust, quote, raises the issue of whether the EPA could enforce or maintain existing fine or coarse particle pollution standards, end quote. EPA's air quality monitors cannot measure particle pollution from certain sources while ignoring particles from other sources. But that's what the bill requires. This would likely invalidate the existing standards and make crafting and implementing a health-based standard for particle pollution virtually impossible. This bill is based on another false premise. EPA scientists reviewed all of the medical evidence and concluded that exposure to coarse particles may cause mortality, cardiovascular effects, and respiratory effects. The science is even more definitive for the deadly effects of fine particles. There's simply no scientific basis for claiming that so-called nuisance dust is safe to breathe. The American people support the Clean Air Act. People want clean air. And over the past 40 years, the Clean Air Act has brought us dramatic air quality improvements. But this committee is intent on undoing these gains. In bill after bill, for one industry or another, this committee has voted to punch holes in the Clean Air Act. It has voted for more weather-altering carbon pollution, more toxic mercury pollution, more arsenic and lead pollution, more sulfur dioxide pollution, and more nitrogen oxide pollution. This committee should support the Clean Air Act, not attack it yet again, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this unnecessary and dangerous piece of legislation. I yield back my time.
Chairman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from West Virginia seek recognition? Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will read the title.
Amendment to H.R. 1633, offered by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order. We haven't seen the amendment.
Okay. The point of order is reserved, and the gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment to H.R. 1633 addresses the concerns that the definition of farm dust may be too broad. Therefore, this amendment clarifies that the definition of nuisance dust in H.R. 1633 does not include coal ash or other coal combustion residuals. As reported to the full committee, the definition of nuisance dust explicitly excluded emissions from combustions. But we'd like to be perfectly clear that nuisance dust is not comprised of any residual from the combustion of coal, and that nothing in the bill prevents the EPA, state, local, or tribal governments from regulating coal ash or other coal combustion residuals. With this amendment, the definition of nuisance dust is clarified to mean particular matter that satisfies 4 conditions. Specifically, it means particular matter that, 1, is generated primarily from natural sources, unpaved roads, agriculture activities, earth moving, or other activities typically conducted in rural areas. 2, consists primarily of soil, other natural or biological materials, or some combination thereof. 3, is not emitted directly into the ambient air from combustion, such as exhaust from combustion engines and emissions from stationary combustion processes. And most importantly, item number 4, is not comprised of residuals from the combustion of coal. These changes make it clear that H.R. 1633 does not hinder the EPA, state, local, or tribal governments from regulating coal ash, because nuisance dust cannot be comprised of coal combustion residuals. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and to support the passage of this legislation.
Would the gentleman yield?
Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I just want to thank him for the amendment. It does address, I know, a concern that was raised. It helps clarify all our great work on making sure coal is a primary commodity for electricity generation in this country. We know it's currently and continually to be under attack. This just takes us off the debate for this issue, and I applaud you for the work on that, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yield back
my
his
time.
time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order. This amendment is clearly germane. Secondly, I want to talk about the amendment itself. The supporters of this bill claim that this bill is about so-called farm dust. But the bill is drafted so broadly that it could exempt dangerous air pollution from a whole range of industrial activities as well. Coal-fired power plants with giant coal ash waste pits are one of the sources of particulate pollution that this bill would exempt from the Clean Air Act. And during the consideration of the coal ash bill that went through this committee, we heard testimony about how wind dispersal of coal ash dust can harm human health. And there are a number of examples of this. This pollution can trigger asthma attacks, exacerbate other respiratory disease. But air pollution from coal ash dumps also can be laced with hexavalent chromium, arsenic, lead, and other heavy metals linked with serious health effects, including lung cancer. Many members of this committee on both sides worked to ensure that the coal ash legislation in the bill we passed would address these health risks. And many members wanted to include dust control, such as covering the ash, storing it in tanks or buildings, or treating it with water. The final bill on coal ash that the committee reported did not include such requirements to address the health risks posed by dust from coal ash pits. It relies exclusively on compliance with any controls imposed under a Clean Air Act state implementation plan. In fact, the Republican committee report on the bill says that the applicable Clean Air Act provisions are adequate to address any potential dust issues at coal ash impoundments. Now, the bill that's before us would eliminate those same Clean Air Act provisions, and that's why I'm going to support this amendment to remove coal ash from the bill's overbroad definition of nuisance dust. We should not exempt coal ash disposal from the Clean Air Act under the guise of protecting farmers. But this amendment just highlights the larger problem with this bill. At the subcommittee markup, the Republicans amended the bill so it would no longer exempt from the Clean Air Act particulate pollution directly emitted from power plant combustion, school buses, and tractors. Now they're excluding particulate pollution from coal ash as well. But the bill still exempts mining operation and smelters. It still blocks controls on particle pollution from cement plants and coal processing plants and other industrial sources typically located in rural areas. And now are we going to pass exclusions from the Clean Air Act exemption for each of these sources, or just certain favored sources and not others? I'm going to have an amendment on this subject in a minute. I don't think that's the proper way to legislate. This bill is based on the false premise that particulate pollution from some activities is harmless, while indistinguishable particulate pollution from other activity harms health. It's no surprise that the legislative structure built on this flawed foundation makes no sense and does not work. While I'll support this amendment, the fact that it is necessary proves that this bill is not limited to farm dust. And while the amendment highlights the bill's flawed approach, it fails to fix it. So I support this amendment as far as it goes, and I'll have another amendment on a similar subject. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the McKinley amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. For what purpose is the gentleman from California?
I have an amendment at the desk, number 2.
If the clerk could read the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1633, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will disperse the text of the amendment to the members, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
The supporters, Mr. Chairman, of this bill claim they're simply trying to exempt so-called farm dust from the Clean Air Act. There are several reasons why it isn't a good idea for public health or public policy, but this bill would exempt pollution from sources well beyond farms. The bill defines nuisance dust to include particulate matter that consists primarily of natural materials that's generated from earth moving. It seems clear that this would include particulate pollution from open pit mines. In the legislative hearing, EPA agreed that the bill would have this effect. While the bill's supporters continue to claim that the bill is for farms, they have not denied that it would also have the effect of exempting particulate pollution from industrial mining operations from the Clean Air Act. This is an egregious overreach. The Kennecott, Utah copper mine serves as a perfect example. Kennecott Copper operates one of the largest open-pit copper mines in the world in Utah. The mine is visible from space. Every day, Kennecott Copper mines about 150,000 tons of copper ore and 330,000 tons of waste rock from its Bingham Canyon mine. Kennecott's operations are the single largest source of particulate pollution in Utah. Salt Lake County, to the east of the mine, violates the health-based limits for both fine and coarse particle pollution. Kennecott accounts for almost a fifth of the county's PM10 emissions and a quarter of the county's PM2.5 emissions. That certainly isn't farm dust. Kennecott wants to expand its Bingham Canyon mine, increasing the amount of rock blasted, hauled, and crushed in the giant pit by 32%, or about 60 million tons each year. This bill would allow Kennecott to increase its pollution without limits by exempting all of its particle pollution from the entire Clean Air Act. This expansion would increase particle pollution in an area that already suffers from bad air quality, and it would leave the 1 million residents of Salt Lake County suffering from harmful air pollution without any recourse to the Clean Air Act. It's not surprising that Kennecott is a member of a coalition supporting this bill. In fact, some people think this is the reason for the bill. This is only one example of a mine that could get a permanent permit to pollute under this legislation. This bill would benefit mines, gravel pits, and other activities across the country that involve earth moving. A few years ago, I released a report with Representative Hilda Solis on the health effects of 17 gravel mining operations that were located in her district in LA. Local residents worried that the mining operations were harming the health of their families. Parents were particularly concerned about asthma, which afflicted many of the children. We found these mining operations were a significant threat. They emitted large quantities of both fine and coarse particulate matter, yet under this bill, they would be exempt from regulation under the Clean Air Act. So my amendment clarifies that this bill does not apply to particle pollution from any mining activities. The science shows that the coarse and fine particle pollution, regardless of the source, can harm public health. That's why I oppose exempting favored sources of this pollution from the Clean Air Act, and I oppose the bill. But at the minimum, just as we just did on coal ash, we should ensure that the bill is true to its name, the Farm Dust Regulation Prevention Act. Large industrial open pit mines and gravel mining operations shouldn't get a free pass to pollute under the guise of helping farmers. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Shimkus, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 2006 EPA itself proposed to exempt rural windblown dust and soils and particulate matter generated by agriculture and mining sources. This amendment is not necessary because mines are already heavily regulated through other statutes, including the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Clean Water Act, Federal Land Policy and Management Act, National Environmental Policy Act, and the list goes on. Rural America needs certainty that the regulation of dust in rural areas is left to states and local authorities. I obviously oppose this amendment. A couple brief facts. I love it when we attack industry and business and jobs. I don't know much. I haven't been to Kennecott. I have been to open pit mining operations in my district. There's not a lot of operation going on right now because there's not a lot of jobs. We're not building stuff. I would love to see earth-moving equipment digging up the soil and creating jobs. Kennecott Mine has 1,885 employees. 1,885 employees. It produces 18 to 25% of the country's copper needs. Obviously, copper is used extensively. Home building, electronics. It is a valuable asset that we have in this country, like all mining operations. And these mining operations are in rural America. You don't see open pit mining in the Los Angeles Basin. You see it in Johnson County. You see it in Monroe County. You see it in areas where you can buy land cheap and dig in the ground. So I would argue against this amendment and for jobs in this country of this assault on working men and women through the Environmental Protection Agency when we have the cleanest air we've had in decades. Just has to stop, and that's the importance of this bill, and that's why we need to reject this amendment.
Gentleman, yield to me.
I'd be happy to yield.
I thank you for yielding to me. Let me point out one that, first of all, there are gravel mines even in Los Angeles. Second of all, the Kennecott Copper Mines employs 1,800 people. They do so under existing law. And under existing law, mines are covered by the Clean Air Act. Under this bill, they will no longer be covered by the Clean Air Act.
If the gentleman would, I'll let you go. I'm just going to also state that mines already are regulated under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. They're regulated under the Clean Water Act. They're regulated under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. They're regulated under the National Environment Policy Act. So they're highly regulated already, and by states themselves.
Gentlemen, yield to me further?
I'd be happy to yield.
I don't dispute they're regulated under other statutes, but they are now regulated under the Clean Air Act, and if this bill passes, they will no longer be regulated. The Clean Air Act protects the public from harmful pollution, and some of this pollution is quite harmful to the public health. Under RCRA, you clean up the mines when they're deserted. Under other laws, they affect other things, but the Clean Air Act affects public health when people either breathe in the air that has these chemicals or otherwise exposed to them in the air itself. So do you see a reason to exempt them from the Clean Air Act?
There is uncertainty placed if the EPA goes down to a 2.5 standard. They already relate under PM10, and that's acceptable. And there has been, in all testimonies, there's been no documented proof on any of these health hazards that you all continue to claim, especially in rural America. So I appreciate the time. We're going to have much more opportunity to debate this, but I would encourage my colleagues to reject this amendment. I have 40 seconds left.
Just a few seconds that you have left. Look, we have a fundamental debate. This bill is supposed to be about farm dust. You're trying to make sure that the bill also covers mining pollution. And I think that that's a different issue, and there's no reason to exempt them under the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act applies now. EPA has not done anything to change the status. Kennecott Copper has 1,800 people working. They want to expand. And if their expansion produces harmful effects from under the Clean Air Act, we shouldn't take them out of it.
And reclaiming my last 5 seconds, we should want Kennecott Copper to expand because that's more jobs. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I support Mr. Waxman's amendment. I think it's a very important one. And I might add to toward the end of the debate that we just heard, that with all of the federal agencies that Mr. Shimkus mentioned, none of them regulate air and air quality, and that's what is at the heart of what we're debating today. I continue to be amazed by the debate we're having in this committee, and I think today's debate is no exception. Our Republican colleagues are talking about protecting farmers from a non-existent threat. The EPA Administrator, Lisa Jackson, has stated publicly that she's reviewed the current science and decided not to propose revising the existing air quality standards for coarse particles. Even worse, I think my Republican colleagues continue to pretend that this bill is about dirt on farms, when in fact the definition of nuisance dust in this bill is so broad that it captures dangerous air pollution from a range of industrial activities. If that's what you want to do, that's what you should call it. But under the guise of dirt on farms, I don't think this really flies. We keep hearing that this bill will give certainty to America's farmers, but what this bill will really do is guarantee that giant multinational mining companies will not have to comply with the Clean Air Act. And that's what's at the heart of this. And that's why I support Mr. Waxman's amendment. It brings honesty to the debate that we're having today. My colleague mentioned the Kennecott copper mine in Utah as an example of a mine that could benefit from this bill's exemption. Kennecott is owned by Rio Tinto, which is headquartered in the UK and Australia. Now, this company can afford to do what it takes to protect public health from the dangerous particle pollution generated from its mining activities in the United States. I'm all for the jobs that they create. I want to see them expand what they're doing. But I believe that it's the Congress and its representatives that need to guarantee the American people that their air is clean. I don't think that's asking something of any company and its activities in the United States. In August, the company announced record earnings for the first half of the year of $7.8 billion. The Kennecott, Utah copper mine is not the only mine that would benefit. It's just happens to be one of the largest. Companies mining for gold, copper, nickel, and other metals across the country would be able to release dangerous fine and coarse particle pollution without limits. Now, how do you go to your constituents and say this passes the sensible test? All in the name of protecting farmers? I mean, I think you've got some things tangled up here. We know that particle pollution can cause asthma attacks, exacerbate chronic lung disease, trigger heart attacks, and lead to premature death. And particulate matter from mines is more likely to be contaminated with heavy metals such as arsenic, lead, chromium, mercury, and other toxic substances. That's quite a stew. That's quite a stew. My colleague's amendment simply states that this bill's exemption for so-called nuisance dust does not apply to particulate matter from mining activities. And if this bill is really about farm dust, then this amendment should be non-controversial, and that's why I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
Would my colleague yield for 30 seconds?
I'd be
Or
glad
whatever.
to.
Just, just put on the record that we're talking about the PM10 standard. Mines are still regulated under the Clean Air Act. And, if we're going to have this debate, we're just clarifying for the debate. Thank you for letting me yield.
Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. No.
Chairman asks for a recorded vote.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will read the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkiss. Mr. Shimkiss votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Daggett votes aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee? Ms. Baldwin? Mr. Ross? Mr. Matheson? Oh, Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Chairman Upton? Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing, Mr. Bass?
Mr. Bass votes no.
Ms. Blackburn? Other members?
Mrs. Blackburn votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, no more, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 yeas, 30 nays.
16 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Chairman. I'll going to yield to the gentlelady next to you who had her hand up first. Ms. Eshoo is.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, number 4.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1633, offered by Ms. Eshoo of California.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the staff will disperse the language of the amendment, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One basic premise of this bill is that nuisance dust, and we have to remember that this is a definition created by political scientists and not scientists, has no harmful health effects, and therefore it's fine to accept nuisance dust, to exempt it from the Clean Air Act. That premise is not based on the science. In fact, it's simply false. The committee recently received a letter, I hope you've all read it, from a team of physicians and researchers at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and I ask, Mr. Chairman, that this letter be placed in the record by
without objection.
Unanimous consent. Thank you. Here's what the experts say about the science. Quote, a large peer-reviewed literature has associated occupational exposure to rural particulate matter with serious adverse health effects, and a growing peer-reviewed literature has associated off-farm exposure to rural particulate matter with serious adverse health effects as well, unquote. The letter cites numerous studies showing that exposure to rural particulate matter can cause serious health effects. One of these studies, published in Environmental Health Perspectives, found that, quote, dust generated by crop and food animal production comprise many different materials, including feces, bacteria, and other hazards. These can cause serious lung diseases, including bronchitis, pneumonia, and viral infections, unquote. The physicians who authored this letter came to a very clear conclusion. They wrote that this legislation, quote, does not account for current or future knowledge of health risks posed by rural particulate matter exposure, and rather enacts a permanent exemption of rural particulate matter from Clean Air Act regulation. This approach is not supported by the scientific evidence or good professional judgment and is not scientifically defensible, unquote. In contrast, there's not a single scientific paper or medical study that shows that, quote, nuisance dust is harmless. That would be impossible since the Republicans invented this new category of pollution just a few weeks ago. So I continue to be amazed at how the majority continues to ignore science on one issue after another. Science. Science. This bill is no exception. It would prohibit the EPA from paying heed to the scientists who say it is important to protect public health from exposure to particle pollution from all sources. My amendment is straightforward. If the administrator and the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee find that this bill could increase the incidence of asthma attacks, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, or premature mortality, then the bill has no effect. And that's why I urge my colleagues to support it.
Gentlelady yield to this side.
I'd be glad to.
I thank the gentlelady from California for yielding. And, you know, in her amendment, the language of the amendment, quite honestly, if it's so purely scientific, I asked the gentlelady, why does the language on line 3 say that the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee finds that application of subsection A could increase the incidence by asthma, respiratory disease, cardiac, etc. It just as well could not. I mean, why wouldn't it say would increase if it were purely scientific? And I yield back to the lady for a response.
Well, I'd be glad to respond if you would support the amendment by changing from could to would. I would accept it. The point here is that scientists have spoken, and I doubt that any one of us would choose for our family, for our children, or if we're blessed enough to have grandchildren, the standards that you're supporting. I think that we have an obligation to pay heed to the scientists in our country. This is not some rump group. This is from the Johns Hopkins Center and the scientists there. So I think that the amendment allows for science and scientists to weigh in and to be instructive to us in shaping public policy. And I want to go back to one of the points that I made, and that is that that science is really left out of this. This is a term. The underlying legislation is based on a term that was made up by politicians, not by scientists. So, I think that I would listen to what scientists have to say and depend on that kind of thinking rather than terms that are made up. And I yield back my time.
Ladies, time has expired. Other members wishing to
May I
speak?
move to
Speak.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
I speak against the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the nuisance dust provisions in the bill. If the EPA determines that these provisions would increase adverse health effects. The bill explicitly allows state, local, and tribal governments to regulate nuisance dust as they deem necessary, and they have a track record of doing so. The bill gives EPA backstop authority to regulate nuisance dust in the absence of such state and local measures if the benefits of doing so outweigh the cost. EPA's own analysis shows that the public health case against coarse particulate matter is weak. And I come from rural America. My first district, there was 19 counties. My current district, I represent 30 counties. In a redrawn district, I'll represent 33 counties. I visit community health clinics. I visited all my hospitals. I visit with my docs. Not once in my 15 years has any healthcare professional in my rural district ever complained about rural dust. Never, ever. The only thing you might get is you might get some city folks who moved to rural America and moved next to some livestock operation, and they may not like some of the aroma that comes, but that's part of living in rural America. I have never, ever had any healthcare profession, hospital, clinic, come to me with the points addressed that it affects the health care of the individuals of
Would the
rural
gentleman
America.
yield?
I would be happy to yield.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I would just like to make one point. As you list out the constituents that you've met with and that they have not raised this, they haven't raised it because the EPA has already, this is regulated and people are protected. This bill strips that. And so I think that we've got a point here that
reclaiming my time,
I have farms. Yeah. I have agriculture in my district.
I would argue that
Valley.
this debate is over PM10 or PM 2.5, which is more strict standard, and we want to maintain the current standard,
but
which
it's not in
is
the bill.
protecting.
PM10 is not in the bill.
That's the whole. This is the whole debate is the particular matter standard, and keeping the EPA from reducing that standard. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Other members, Mr. Waxman. Oh, yeah, Mr. Waxman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to address my comments to the chair, to the gentleman from Illinois. This bill, you say, exempts them from the PM10 standard, but the bill goes beyond that. It exempts them from the PM10, the PM 2.5, and the toxics. You're saying that people in your rural area don't have a problem. Well, they don't have a problem because in your area they're in compliance with the requirements under the law. But this bill would change that. And what our colleague, Ms. Eshoo, is suggesting is fine, go along with this change. But if it turns out that, and the argument is that this change is okay because it's not a harmful issue. But the amendment states that the exemption from the Clean Air Act for nuisance dust will have no effect if the EPA administrator, in consultation with the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, determines that the exemption would harm public health. So it seems to me that's a responsible approach. You exempt them from the Clean Air Act, but if it turns out, based on the science, there is a harm, we won't exempt them from the Clean Air Act. The gentleman from Georgia said, well, it should be would instead of could. I agree with him. I would like to make a unanimous consent request to do that, but before I do, I don't know if that's going to satisfy everybody because, as I understand Mr. Shimkus' arguments, that if there are other regulations, then we shouldn't have the Clean Air Act apply. Well, the Clean Air Act applies at the present time. If there's no harm from the pollution, then there's no reason to regulate. There's no regulation that people are concerned about now if they're under compliance. So let me ask unanimous consent, whether you'll agree to the amendment or not, that the word could be changed to would on line 3 of the amendment.
There's a unanimous consent request. Is there objection to
I
changing
object.
the word? Objection is heard.
Who has objected?
I object. We don't know. Permission to speak?
I'll yield to you, yes.
One, you can't prove a negative. And so this amendment basically says prove a negative. Secondly, you can't just by fiat say that something will or will not.
Well, reclaiming my time, the language of the Eshoo amendment says, if the administrator, in consultation with the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, finds that application of subsection A, she would say would instead of could, if you would allow her, if you would allow could to be would, increase the incidence of asthma. So they have to make a scientific finding, not a negative, but a scientific finding that there would be an increase in the incidence of asthma attacks, respiratory diseases, or cardiovascular diseases, etc. So it doesn't make any difference to me. I would think would make sense, and I don't know why.
Can I make a second comment?
Certainly.
I have concern with how EPA determines this. In our last meeting with EPA, there was a conversation in which I asked if the EPA is saying that there is a premature incidence of death, are they comparing that among asthmatics? Are they comparing that to asthmatics in another location? Or are they comparing that to the general population in another location?
Reclaiming my time.
Well, can I finish the point? And that person replied, we're comparing it to the general population. We're not comparing it to asthmatics. Now, I hope.
I want to reclaim my time, which I have a right to do. It seems to me that the whole basis of the Clean Air Act is a scientific finding about the health impact of pollution. And the health impact of pollution is based on the concentration, the exposure, wherever that may be, whether it's a rural area or an urban area. And then they set a standard of what is an appropriate amount of exposure to that pollutant. And then it's up to the local government, usually the states, to develop an implementation plan to come into compliance. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer a second-degree amendment to change the word could on line 3 to would.
I think you have to.
Since we can't get unanimous consent, I so move it. If you want, we'll hustle and get it in writing, but I'm making the motion. It'll be a fairly clear-cut one, and we ought to vote on it.
I think we all understand it. I'm not sure that we need it in writing. Right? There's an amendment to change the word could to would in line 3 of the amendment offered by Ms. Eshoo. Those in favor of the amendment change will vote aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Gentlemen will proceed. Actually, the gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment
Mr.
as
Chairman.
amended?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bill Bray from California.
You know, Mr. Chairman, I wish those of us in Washington understand that Washington and the federal government is not the alpha and the omega when it comes to public health. There's members of this committee are acting like if EPA doesn't do it, it never gets done. That EPA somehow has scientists and researchers better than everybody else in this country, and that only the federal government can do this. And now I'll just say this. I take real personal offense to that attitude for everybody who's in local and state agencies that are doing public health and clean air strategies, as if Washington knows best always. And so I just got to remind all of you, there's a whole lot of people and agencies out there that are not only doing a good job, they're doing a damn better job to the point that the federal government many times stands in the way of public health.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
I think the gentleman and I have something in common, and what has been highly instructive to us, and that is that before we came to Congress, we both served on our respective air district boards in California. And if there was a place where I learned not only what the California Clean Air Act was about, but also saw how we implemented it, our standards were even higher than what the federal Clean Air Act is. So my thinking and my approach on this really was shaped when I was in local government and represented my county on the Bay Area Air Quality Management District Board, and it's a combination of that. I don't think that there's, I'm not coming from only one place and one perfection. This is a partnership with states and regions across our country, and I think the American people have won. I appreciate your yielding.
Time. I understand that. The 10 years I served on an air district, the 6 years, though, at the Air Resources Board, where I'll just be frank with you, that the Air Resources Board scientists found again and again that the federal government was operating off of bad science. So when people in this committee talk about science, I can go down the list of mistakes the federal government has done in the name of protecting the environment that has actually hurt the environment. So I just hope you understand good intentions of the federal government going into local states and communities and imposing their perception of good science doesn't work out the way you always think it does. And so I just want to say again, this bill specifically says if the locals who are breathing the air are engaged in the issue, who has more of a vested interest at seeing a safe outcome than the people who live in the community? Do you really think Washington, D.C. cares more about the air in California or in Montana than the people who live in California and Montana? And oh, by the way, When I got here, I was appalled to see what this city does with its air pollution. But I'm not going to sit there and say that we're going to now mandate that California dictate everything to everybody else. So I got to say this again. I just want to bring this out. I apologize. This bill specifically says, give the locals the priority. If they're addressing it, then allow them to take the lead on this issue. But you're been superseded again and again, not only by federal heavy-handedness, but by federal special interest groups, by federal bad science, by federal attitude that Washington knows best. And I yield it on that. I apologize, but I've sit here for long enough and keep hearing these comments. And I think we got to make it clear that Washington should be working to help the locals, not mandating on the locals. And I rest again. Who cares more about the air in the community, Washington, D.C., or the community itself?
Gentlemen, yield.
I will yield.
I thank you for yielding. First of all, I'd like to have the record kept open so you could put in some examples of bad science coming out of EPA that has caused problems, because I'd be very interested in that report. But the whole basis of the
Mr.
Clean
Chair,
Air
I
Act...
yield them back. I'll give you right back. Using tailpipe emissions and rather than total emissions with automobile emissions. That's bad science, and I'll bring that up until I leave this
I want the record to be open. I want you to stand by your statement. But the Clean Air Act requires the EPA to set the national air quality standards based on medical evidence of the health effects from exposure to air pollution. Then the state and local governments that care as much about this issue as anyone else figures out how to meet those health-based standards. That's the way it's worked for 40 years. I don't think we have, at the local government level, the ability to set different standards for exposure to air pollution. That's why we have a Clean Air Act that has a federal standard that's set by EPA that has the expertise in consultation with the medical community.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
In support of the amendment, and I'd like to explain to my colleagues something that I don't think anybody on the other side is realizing. Air moves around. When there's pollution in Detroit, it will go to Toledo or across the river into Windsor, Ontario. California's pollution moves east and can be found in the eastern part of the United States. This stuff doesn't just sit in a place, it moves around. That's why it is a federal question. And that's why the federal government sets standards to affect all of the pollution, because we're all breathing stuff that is generated more by others than it is by us. But we contribute our fair share of the problems to others. Having said this, this whole bill is a mess. There is no need for it. The two newspapers in the state of the author, starting with the Argus leader, had some interesting observation to say. It's disappointing, they say, to see the authors of the legislation fighting against a made-up problem like the potential for farm dust regulations by the Environmental Protection Agency. And they point out the problem is that the EPA has repeatedly and at every turn said that it has no intention of regulating farm dust. On Monday, it went as far as to write a letter to Congress stating it would not be regulating dust kicked up by combines. That should put the issue to rest. And so we have here a magnificent straw man, which we are beating the bejabbers out of, and we have a solution which is scurrying around to find a use. There is no need for this legislation. Now let's hear what the Press and Decoded says. They say, we've been skeptical ever since we began hearing allegations that the EPA was going to crack down on farm dust, and for good reason. It's a myth. The EPA reinforced that fact in a recent letter to 2 U.S. senators. And even the president of the National Farmers Union said he hopes It puts to rest the misinformation regarding dust regulation. However, these latest developments don't seem to have cleared the dust from the eyes of the sponsors of the legislation. They are vowing to continue to push this legislation. We wish that those pushing this legislation would stop trying to stir the fear of farmers and ranchers and instead spend their time on fighting real problems rather than imagined ones. Now, EPA had some other things to say in a letter signed by Lisa Jackson, the administrator. They said, we have been making steady progress on reducing the emissions of particulate matter, both fine and coarse, in this country for more than 2 decades, providing the public health of Americans while the economy has continued to grow. It's important that a standard for particulate matter be protective of the health of the public. Based on my consideration of the scientific record, and this is Lisa Jackson, the administrator speaking, I am prepared to propose the retention with no revision of the current PM10 standard and form that is sent to OMB for interagency review. What she's saying is that here we have a vast tempest in a teapot, where we're attacking a problem that does not exist, where we're beating a straw man and wasting the time of the Congress and the committee on doing things about a problem which does not exist. So I would urge my colleagues, let's adopt the amendment, let's vote against the bill, let's get down to more serious business like jobs and the economy, and focus on the business that the American people want us to do instead of beating the bejeebers out of straw men and trying to help a solution find a place to be inserted into the law to solve a problem which does not exist. I yield back to balance.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a couple reasons why I think this amendment is troubling. It's based upon having the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee establish policy without any oversight. Let's think of a couple of things here. First of all, they are appointed by the EPA, and the title scientist does not make someone unbiased or remove all conflicts of interest. Now, they're also paid by the EPA, and they write the articles that they reference with regard to science. That in itself is a huge conflict of interest. But it is also a matter that, once again, we are in a position where Congress is abdicating its own role of oversight. And that is, rather than have scientific findings come back to Congress where we would review them and look at its impact upon policy and law and regulations, we advocate responsibility to this group of appointed scientists of which Congress has absolutely no authority to review what they're saying, and this solidifies and codifies that authority and abdicates congressional responsibility. Now, with regard to responding to Congress, I'd also like to reference back in March when we had a hearing here with Administrator Jackson, and a subsequent time she's appeared here, I have asked her to specifically respond to my request to what objections the EPA has to Pennsylvania's laws or regulations. Are they adequate or inadequate when it comes to dealing with fracking for natural gas? And if they are adequate, then are they adequately or inadequately enforced? She has not responded to either. That I use as just an example from this year where the EPA has refused to respond to Congress. Now, I think they have a responsibility to us. We are the ones appointed by the Constitution to establish the laws and to have oversight over them. The troubling thing about this is not that we don't want to review science. Indeed, we do, and we should. But science itself has a number of times over the years when there's been frauds and hoaxes over centuries where people live by what was then seen as the science of the day, only to find out later whether it was the issue of Einstein's expanding universe, cold fusion. So many other issues have come up over time where people thought science was one way and later on found out it was not. I don't want to have these things set in law by groups that have absolutely no oversight from Congress. And I believe that this is a serious problem, and we should be, if we really are concerned about science and we really are concerned about our role as members of Congress, we should have oversight and do not, under any circumstances, continue down this road of abdicating. Congress has done this in the past. I think this has been done on a basis of trust, but I'm seriously concerned now that this has gone so far that when we hear from the EPA that they also say they will not take into account impact upon jobs or the economy, and when we have a situation here where they refuse to respond to congressional inquiries about findings, that tells us that let's not continue down this road of having no congressional oversight. And I would like to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Nebraska.
I may use more than a minute 40, so can I decline it?
Would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman yield.
Would the gentleman?
I'll yield to Mr.
Yeah, and I'll be quick too. When Assistant Administrator McCarthy was before us, and we asked her specifically on this bill, her response was, "As of now." That was her response, "As of now." So I said, "What about tomorrow?" And the question was, she was silent. So this bill codifies what it would be congressional intent on the PM10 standards. Let me also say that just because the administration promises something doesn't mean they will do that. The administration promised a decision on Keystone XL pipeline in December. That's not going to happen because they have broken their promise on permitting the Keystone XL pipeline for whatever, we know the reasons. So just because they say they're not going to do something doesn't mean they're not going to do it. And that's why we have to move legislation. And I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman yield.
Yield to the gentleman from California.
As I understand your argument, EPA appoints the scientific panel, and just because somebody calls himself or herself a scientist, that's not good enough.
No, it's not what I said, sir. It has to do with what is the oversight. And although one assumes that they're appointing people who have the scientific credentials, Congress has no authority to review. And your amendment would automatically, as the wording is here, automatically eliminate Congress's oversight over that. And I think that's a problem, given that this panel is political appointees by the EPA. They're paid by the EPA. And I think there's serious questions about whether there's conflicts of interest. And along those lines, I would not like to advocate our responsibility.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak? Mr. Towns, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to a gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
I thank you for yielding because I want to examine that argument that has just been made by the previous speaker. So the scientific panel is appointed by the EPA. We can review who they appoint. That's a legitimate part of our oversight. If they're appointing people who have no scientific qualifications, we ought to know about it. And the way to correct any bias that scientists might have, because after all, some of these people, as I understood their argument, have written articles on the subject. Well, I would certainly want people who have some knowledge of the subject to be on the advisory committee. We can review what they have to say, but it's hard for me to imagine how Congress is going to exercise oversight over what these scientists are saying without holding a hearing and bringing other scientists in, which is a job that EPA is supposed to be doing. Now, we have the ability to do oversight. We also have the ability to stop a regulation if they propose one that's not, if Congress doesn't feel it's based on the science. I can easily imagine what it would be like if we were sitting here reevaluating the science. We would have people's talking points based on what's given to them by the interest groups that don't want to be regulated. And they would say, this scientist had a conflict of interest because he's written 20 articles on this subject and he's stale or he has a bias. Well, okay, that's an argument that can be made, but I don't know if that's a really productive way for us to evaluate the science. Now, a gentleman from Pennsylvania argued EPA hasn't answered all the requests from members of the committee, and he cited that they haven't answered his inquiry about fracking. Well, this bill is not about fracking. But the fracking issue, as far as I know, EPA is studying, and maybe they're not in a position yet to answer it. They may be looking at something other TSCA, but they're studying the issue. They haven't done anything. When they do something, then we ought to look at it carefully and maybe even if they propose something under the Congressional Review Act, use that time to exercise our oversight. But it seems to me, involved in this debate is that there's something wrong with having scientific advisory committees appointed by the EPA that may have some funding from EPA, I suppose, for their incidental expenses. This is painting a picture of a conflict that I don't see.
Will the gentleman
yield so I could
If there's
respond?
a conflict, we ought to have it raised. I would hope the gentleman from New York would do that.
Be delighted to yield.
I think.
Wait, could you?
Yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank
Yielding to
you.
you.
And I appreciate the gentleman's concerns. I just want to make it clear what I'm saying here. I have no objections to scientists being involved. As a scientist, as having some scientific training myself, I consider that to be the high standard we should be looking to. But it's also obligation of scientists to be willing to review contradictory information. My concern here is that with your amendment is not whether or not we should be looking to scientific information. I think that is vital and that's important. What I want to make sure is we don't abdicate automatically congressional oversight in this. And what I was referring to with fracking was that in this instance, the EPA, I think, should be coming back to this committee and not necessarily have things automatically become regulation, but let's have congressional oversight. And I use that example of twice I've asked Administrator Jackson for information and have yet to receive that, but it has a big impact upon Pennsylvania's economy. So it's not about whether or not scientists have responsibility in this or qualifications. It's how Congress would automatically abdicate our role in reviewing that. I yield back.
I reclaim my time and yield to the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Towns. I think that this is an important discussion and debate on my amendment. And I think that as one member of this committee, and I think this is something that's shared by all the members of the committee, how important congressional oversight is. There isn't anything in this amendment that eliminates congressional oversight.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, if you want to go to the amendment, it's very clear. It lists the limitation. If the administrator, in consultation with the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, finds that application of subsection A could or would, well, we changed it to would increase the incidence of the health impacts, then the subsection shall cease to apply. So I don't think there's any place in this where congressional oversight is curbed or eliminated or injured. So I appreciate that concern.
Gentlemen, just for one last second, it's not automatic. It says that it could increase the incidence of impact on health, and then the subsection won't apply, and the subsection that won't apply is exempting them from any regulation by the EPA, because there's no reason to exempt them from regulation if they're harmful. The argument that's the premise for the bill is that they're not harmful. Well, if they are, we should allow them to be regulated if it's appropriate.
Thank you much, Madam Chair. My time has expired. Thank you for your generosity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the requisite number of words. And, you know, if you look at the overall impact, or I mean, efforts from various agencies right now, many of our farm groups and farmers and ranchers, at least in the Nebraska area, I can't testify to Illinois or any other states, but they really feel that with this administration, there is a war on farmers. And the EPA and the dust issue is fairly central to their feeling that they are under attack. I just got to deal with an issue about 14 and 15-year-olds being able to detassel because the Labor Department wants to end that. They want to end children of farmers being able to do handiwork around the farm. They're attacking the very culture of farming today. And this is just one example. Now, there was my favorite member over from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, mentioned the Farmer Union letter, but I can tell you in my personal discussions with Farm Bureau, our corn growers, our wheat growers, our soybean growers, all of them are worried about the EPA and the dust. So I don't have letters to submit, but I can tell you they are all concerned about how the EPA can come in on their new particulate for dust or particles, apply it to dust, and shut down farming as we know it today. You can say that's ridiculous. Lisa Jackson was here and said we're not going to apply that to agriculture, so this is just talk of fairy dust. Well, that's interesting that we call it fairy dust as if it's fictional. And then the next paragraph of the argument is, and I have scientific studies that say fairy dust is harmful to human health. So the reality is the current EPA director can come before us and say on the record that she is not intending to apply a new particulate rule to dust, but the reality is she's one lawsuit away from a court order to do so, because as the gentlelady from California read, there's already studies out there by some scientists that say it's harmful. Therefore, it's an open and shut case that we will have to regulate, unless Congress steps in and says you can't regulate farm dust. And that's why, to save our farming as we now know it, because frankly, I can't imagine what the rules would be to allow farming when there will be dust. I can't tell you enough. When you till the soil, you're going to have dust. When you drive on a non-paved gravel or dirt road, there will be dust. And the way the EPA has historically worked, at least our experience in Nebraska with, for example, copper pipes, they forced every city or small town that was using well water to have to put in a water treatment plant. We came in and said, why don't we just pay to have every pipe removed and put in with PVC? And they said, no, this is our way. So they've already proved that they're going to go to the extremes and not be practical in its application. That's what scares the hell out of our farmers in Nebraska. This is why it's important that we specifically state that farming and ranching is going to be exempt. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members, the gentlelady from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
Yielding to me. I didn't think we were going to have to go into a tutorial on the Clean Air Act. But I've never heard this committee spend so much time debating stuff that had nothing to do with the issue at hand. First of all, let's understand, when we're talking about EPA regulating this and that and the other thing, yes, they do. And there's oftentimes a very good reason for doing this. Now, I have a better record of fighting EPA when they were doing something stupid than anybody on this committee. And it's cost me dear. But I'll try and explain what EPA does so that perhaps my colleagues can understand. First of all, we're talking about the Clean Air Act. Second of all, we're talking about particulates. Particulates come from all kinds of sources, from people driving cars, from trucks, from what falls off of trucks, from smoke from chimney smokestacks, households, from somebody beating a rug in their backyard. And what EPA does is to administer a law which requires them to identify the levels of particulates that constitute a risk to the public health and the environment. When they have done this in a proper scientific fashion, they then proceed to require the states, and this is something which happened a long time ago, about 30 or 40 years ago, to issue regulations controlling the level of these kinds of pollutants that are getting into the environment. They do this on water. They do this on air. It was a source of long contention in the Congress about how the states were going to be participating in the problems of regulating. We one time had a president who said water pollution is a uniquely local blight. Well, it turns out that that's not quite true. When somebody flushes a toilet up in Minneapolis at the headwaters of the Mississippi, about 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, the folks in Louisiana know what that fellow had for dinner. And the same situation obtains with regard for clean water and for clean air. So what we are here doing is to reducing the level and the burden of emissions to levels which do not constitute a risk to human health and the environment. That's all we're doing. EPA has said that they are not going to regulate farm dust. The simple fact of the matter is we have to regulate the levels of particulates because they fly around in the air. And people in Nevada know what's going on in California because the wind moves that way. And my people in Michigan know what's going on across the Lake Michigan in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Illinois because the wind blows that way. And so what we're trying to do is to see to it that we achieve a fair regulation. I don't know why it is impossible for members of this committee to accept the word of the administrator of EPA that she's not going to do this. I do believe that we have things that are more important to do than taking on EPA over something they say they're not going to do, when we're in fact announcing our great agreement with that agency on this particular point. So what EPA does under the law is to fix standards for emissions, which it turns then over to the states to administer. And the result is that everybody gets clean air. Now, the Clean Air Act is one of the nastiest things that we have to deal with. Last time we dealt with it, it took us 13 years to write the legislation. And we were in conference in the Senate for 18 hours, or rather for 18 months, to get the business done. We finally finished it. I would beg you to not go into this question until you know what the consequences are of what you're doing. The simple fact of the matter is EPA is not going to do anything to this. And what we ought to be doing is simply going home and telling our Farm Bureau, as I have to do from time to time, fellas, you don't have anything to worry about because this is not going to happen. So I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. I think we're close to actually voting on the amendment. Gentlemen, let me go to Mr. Whitfield first. Maybe you can share time. Let me make an announcement as well. A number of members have talked about lunch, and and I'm not paying for it. So my intention is that we'll deal with these amendments until shortly after 12. We'll finish what the amendment is that we're working on then, and we will adjourn and come back promptly at 1 o'clock. So I'll just give people notice that we'll take that time to be away. And I yield now to the gentleman from, first from Louisiana, and he'll yield to the gentleman, I hope, from Kentucky.
I will. Mr. Dingell, I have so much respect for you and Mr. Waxman, and I was trying to think of what my objections are, and it's because, frankly, I'm not sure we can trust the EPA's scientific communities. Now, that is not me speaking. That is the National Academy of Science and their findings on the EPA's formaldehyde rule. And I have here, and they came and testified, and National Academy of Science was as blunt as they could be in the sort of testimony that they would give. And I'll just read one thing. The National Academy of Science found that the EPA's draft assessment on formaldehyde, which I think took them 13 years, was not prepared in a logically consistent fashion, lacked clear links to an underlying conceptual framework, did not sufficiently document methods and criteria used to identify evidence for selecting and evaluating studies. And I could go on, but I think you get the point. And so if we were sure, and the National Academy of Science has recommended certain reforms for how the EPA does reports. I was trying to hastily draft up an amendment to Ms. Issue's amendment that would require them, if they did do such an evaluation, to have fully implemented the National Academy of Science's recommendations. But frankly, until scientists can feel better about how the EPA is delivering their recommendations, I have pause about accepting those recommendations. And again, that's not based upon partisanship. It's based upon what the National Academy of Science's critique is of how EPA does their work. I will.
I say this with all respect. There's a thing called oversight. This committee and every committee in the Congress is supposed to engage in oversight.
Reclaiming my time, I accept that. I accept that without doubt. But apparently the comment period upon the EPA rule on formaldehyde was so short that the Texas Department of Environmental Quality said, listen, we can't even figure out their methodology in a way to figure out what was wrong.
Well, but with respect to my friend, this, and I can understand your frustrations on dealing with these issues, because most people don't understand the law, they don't tell us the truth about it, and not infrequently EPA does some very stupid things. That's why we have an oversight subcommittee that's supposed to haul these folks up here and say, fellas, why are you doing something as stupid as this?
I accept that, but when the comment period is 30 days, or when the issues are so complex that the scientists themselves...
With all respect, that 30 days comment period doesn't limit this committee to hauling them up here and saying...
Reclaiming my time, but it does limit the ability of people like Texas DEQ to do a thorough consideration of what the work is. Our critique is going to be based upon that critique of others. If EPA instituted these National Academy of Science recommendations, which frankly that seems a pretty reasonable thing to do, I would have much more faith in what they do.
If the
Mr. Dingell, let me reclaim my time and give it to Mr. Whitfield because I was asked to do so by my chairman.
If the gentleman would yield, this is probably a subject for a good hearing. And I'll join the gentleman in requesting that we have a hearing into this matter to haul EPA up and help instruct them on what should be done.
Consider it requested, but I will work with you on that. But let me reclaim my time to give to Mr. Whitfield, please.
Certainly want to thank the gentleman, and I would just say that Christy Nome and Mr. Pompeo, in my view, have a very reasonable piece of legislation here. First of all, it delays implementation. It simply prohibits EPA from doing this anytime within 1 year after the enactment of the legislation. So it's not even permanent, first of all. Second of all, we know that so many decisions are being made today on environmental regulations by the court system, and it doesn't make any difference what Administrator Jackson says. We know that groups are prepared to file lawsuits to require this ambient air quality or particulate matter standard to be changed. For example, the Wild Earth Guardians is considering suing the EPA over this very matter. And when you consider the overall economic condition we find ourselves in today, and when at our hearing, farmers came in, cattle growers came in, and one cattleman said at our hearing that he is required to spread 4 gallons of water around his feedlot for every cow that he has. And so we also heard testimony that in Arizona on certain windy days they're prohibited from plowing or doing anything. So this is a very reasonable piece of legislation that is not permanent, and when you consider the economic condition we find ourselves in today, I think Congress is simply asserting itself and saying we don't want the court to decide this right now. We want to delay this for a period of time until our economy can renew itself and strengthen.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote will occur on the amendment as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Noes appear to have it. The noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to, and the clerk will call the roll as a recorded vote was requested.
Mr. Barton, Mr. Stearns, Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to vote, Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Stearns votes no.
Mr. Barton.
Mr. Barton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast.
Chairman.
Mr. Shimkus.
No.
Mr. Shimkus votes no.
Other members wishing to cast the vote. Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. While the clerk is reporting the tally, I just want to repeat again that we'll try to finish this next amendment, vote on it, and then adjourn until 1 o'clock. We do one more vote, but it shouldn't. Yeah, hopefully.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 18 ayes, 33 nays.
18 ayes, 33 nays. The amendment as amended is not agreed to. Are there other amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Mr. Rush, what number is your amendment?
Rush 01.
Isn't it 8? It's 8, I think. It's Amendment 8.
08.
Amendment to H.R. 1633, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the subcommittee's hearing on H.R. 1633, we heard testimony from the bill's sponsor, Ms. Christy Nome, that the intent was to address the, quote, regulatory uncertainty in the, quote, over coarse particulate matter or farm dust. However, during that same hearing, we also heard testimony from Administrator Gina McCarthy, where she expressed serious concerns over the ambiguous language in the bill and the overly broad impact it could have on existing Clean Air Act programs. Mr. Chairman, if the premise of the bill is to simply provide regulatory certainty to rural farmers and reiterate what Administrator Jackson has already publicly stated, that EPA would not alter the Bush era standards for coarse particulate matter, then I have an amendment that will satisfy that objective. On page 2, line 13 through 15, my amendment will strike, quote, applicable to particulate matter with an aerodynamic diameter greater than 2.5 micrometers, end of quote, and insert for PM10. At the end of section 2, my amendment will add the following. Nothing in this act precludes the administrator from proposing, finalizing, implementing, or enforcing the National Primary Ambient Air Quality Standard or the National Secondary Air Quality Standard for PM 2.5, end of quote. Mr. Chairman, this would make it absolutely crystal clear in legislative language that Section 2 would not block EPA's ongoing review and rulemaking for PM 2.5 of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Additionally, because there is such widespread suspicion that the real intent of this legislation is to roll back existing Clean Air Act protections, which goes far beyond the narrowly defined objectives that the bill's sponsor articulated in the subcommittee hearing, my amendment will strike Section 3 altogether, which contains the most overly ambiguous and excessively broad provisions of this bill. As drafted, H.R. 1633 could hinder or even prevent the EPA from reducing deadly fine particle pollutions as well as coarse particulate matter in rural and urban areas all across the country. In Section 3, the bill's exclusion for particulate matter from combustion would not exclude particulate pollution from all such industrial activities that generate particulate matter through processes other than combustion, such as milling, grinding, smelting, or other high-temperature industrial processes. Ms. McCarthy raised serious concerns about the effect of this bill on existing health-based standards because the current air quality standards do not distinguish between nuisance dust and other particles. And since the term nuisance dust is not a scientifically defined term, it's probably hocus pocus, domino science, it would really be very difficult to incorporate a scientifically based program. As Ms. McCarthy noted, coarse particles have been linked to a variety of adverse health effects, including hospital visits related to cardiovascular or respiratory disease and premature death. While the body of scientific evidence is much more limited for coarse PM than that for fine particles, the agency's review of the studies indicate that short-term exposures to coarse particles remain of concern. Mr. Chairman, my amendment will remove the ambiguity from this bill and will keep in place standards to protect America's health. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, the bill is called the Farm Dust Regulation Prevention Act. That name is misleading for a couple of reasons. First, there's nothing to prevent because nothing is happening. EPA Administrator Jackson has publicly announced she will not propose to revise the standards for coarse particles, which have been in place since 1987. But wait a minute, some of my colleagues are saying. She could be sued and forced to regulate, and therefore her assurances aren't good enough. Well, Mr. Rush's amendment codifies the administrator's commitment for 1 year. Secondly, the bill's supporters often describe dirt kicked up from plows and cows as a type of particle pollution that should be exempted from the Clean Air Act. But this bill goes well beyond so-called farm dust. The bill creates and exempts from the Clean Air Act a new category of pollution. A new category of pollution created in this legislation without any scientific basis for that category. The introduced bill would have exempted particulate pollution from power plants and school buses. When we pointed that out, the Republicans said, oh, no, we don't mean that. So they amended that out. But even after they amended it out, the definition is still very broad. For example, the definition of nuisance dust includes particle pollution from earth moving, which captures more than just a plow pushing dirt around a farm. Large open pit mining, we had a debate on that. Oh, that's okay. That's part of the thing we don't want the EPA to cover, even though some of those open mines operations could have sand and gravel quarries creating large amounts of particulate pollution through earth moving. The definition also could capture particle pollution generated by other industrial operations that often are located in rural areas, such as cement kilns, coal processing plants, which generate particle pollution from the crushing, grinding, and unloading of materials. So under the guise of protecting farmers, this bill would exempt particle pollution from open pit mines, sand and gravel quarries, cement kilns, coal processing plants, and other industrial processes from the entire Clean Air Act. Now, unlike the comment made by my good friend from Kentucky, this is a permanent change in the law. It's not a temporary one. It's a permanent change in the law that EPA may not regulate these pollutants permanently under the Clean Air Act. Well, talk about science. Reams of science and medical studies have demonstrated that fine particles trigger asthma attacks, heart attacks, strokes, and lead to premature deaths. In contrast, the Republicans don't have a single shred of scientific evidence to show that exempting so-called nuisance dust won't harm public health. They just say it should be exempted. EPA raised concerns that Section 2 of the bill could prevent EPA from revising the health-based standards for fine particles, even if the administrator determines that the current fine particle standard is inadequate to protect public health. Now, periodically updating these standards is important because it means that they can look at the latest scientific evidence, and the administrator's responsibilities And that's one of the most important ones. If you want to change the way EPA looks at the science, that's another issue. But to say they should ignore the science is not what this committee ought to be doing. So the Rush Amendment addresses the bill's fatal flaws. It clarifies that nothing in this bill is intended to prevent EPA from revising air quality standards for fine particles. It also strikes the poorly worded exemption for nuisance dust that could allow deadly fine and coarse particle pollution from a range of industrial sources to escape any Clean Air Act regulation. This bill creates more problems than the imaginary ones it purports to solve. And I think the Rush Amendment is well taken. It will try to make this bill more rational than it is now, and I urge members to support the Rush Amendment.
Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment was debated and defeated in the subcommittee. Couple reasons why. This would eliminate Section 3, which both defines and exempts rural nuisance dust from the federal regulation, providing certainty and regulatory relief. That's kind of why we have the bill here. I don't know how many times we can say it, is that when Assistant Administrator testified, she said at this time, we don't trust the EPA. We know they'll come back. And we know they'll go after dust, coarse particulates in rural America. That's why we have this bill. It's always been interesting. The President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness came out with a report. There's only one sector that from December 2007 until today has created jobs in America. One sector. And that's the mining sector. And yeah, it's called farm dust, but I'm here for my open pit mines in southern Illinois, that we don't close them down and that we can still have a thriving mining sector in this country. Again, for us it's about jobs, and an overzealous EPA, our attempt to codify this so that in the coarse particulate matter, the dust aspect, the EPA stays out of it. The fine particulate matter standards, EPA still doesn't interfere with EPA's ability to implement its fine particulate matter standards. So this is about core standards. This is about rural agricultural dust. This is about mining dust in parts of our country that you have to drive many miles to see anyone. And with that, I'll yield to my friend from Kentucky.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I might add that we have over 180 organizations that actually support this legislation, and the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, as the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, Mr. Rush offered this amendment subcommittee, and we had a big discussion about it at that time. It was defeated, and I would point out also that EPA still can regulate if the nuisance dust is not regulated under state, tribal, or local law. So for that reason, I would respectfully ask that we all on our side oppose Mr. Rush's amendment. And yield back to the gentleman from Illinois.
And I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote will occur on the amendment offered by gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor say aye.
Mr. Chairman.
All those opposed say
Roll
no.
call, Mr. Chairman.
No. Opinion of the chair, the noes win. A roll call is requested, and the clerk will call the roll. This will be the last vote before lunch.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield.
No.
Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack votes no. Mr. Walden.
No
Mr. Walton votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick.
So we'll come back to one.
Mrs. Myrick votes no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes no.
We're going to come back.
Mr. Bass.
One,
Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey.
roll votes until you return.
Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers.
Wait till you come back.
Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes
Yeah,
no.
say
Mr.
that.
Lance.
I'll say
Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no.
if you're
Mr.
not,
Olson.
we conclude the amendment.
Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to vote, Mr. Barton?
Mr. Barton votes no.
Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns votes no.
Other members wishing to vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 18 ayes, 31 nays.
18 ayes, 31 nays. The amendment is not agreed to, and we will now recess until 1 o'clock.